What happens when life comes to a halt, teetering on the fragile edge of existence? For centuries, people have recounted extraordinary tales of what lies beyond. Moments of light, inexplicable peace, or profound clarity as their lives hung by a thread. These stories, often called near-death experiences (NDEs), bridge the mysterious gap between life and death, offering a glimpse into something few have ever seen and lived to share. This is the story of Lucas, a man who didn't believe in miracles or the supernatural. A skeptic at heart, he approached life with a practical mind and a carefully crafted routine. To him, the world was what it appeared to be, physical, tangible, and governed by logic. But on an ordinary day, an extraordinary event shattered his reality. An accident, a sudden, irreversible plunge into the unknown, brought him face to face with something that defied explanation. Lucas returned to life, but he was no longer the same. What he saw, what he felt, and what he understood during those fleeting moments of near-death forever altered his perception of life, death, and the space in between. This story isn't about answers. It's not about proving or disproving what lies beyond our last breath. It's about a journey, a deeply personal and transformative encounter with the unknown. Whether you see it as spiritual, scientific, or somewhere in between, Lucas's experience challenges us to question what we think we know about the end of life and what might come after. Prepare yourself for a story that will take you to the brink of existence and beyond. Lucas's journey is not just about survival. It's about discovery, and perhaps a reminder of the fragile beauty of the life we live every day. And so it begins. The day began like countless others. The soft hum of morning birdsong mingled with the distant noise of cars outside, a subtle symphony of life stirring awake. Rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, tracing golden streaks on the hardwood floor. Lucas lay sprawled across his bed, arms and legs splayed, as though the universe had deposited him there. His alarm clock buzzed insistently, and with a groan he slapped at it, silencing the noise. He rolled over, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and stared blankly at the ceiling for a moment before dragging himself upright. Lucas was a 32-year-old graphic designer living in a modest, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood. His days were a predictable cycle of emails, creative briefs, deadlines, and late-night coffee breaks. Though he enjoyed his work and was good at it, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. The restlessness had grown stronger lately, a faint but persistent whisper urging him to do more, to be more. That Thursday morning seemed no different. He moved through his usual routine with mechanical precision, making coffee, checking his phone for notifications, and skimming through his inbox. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes landed on an email that seemed out of place among the work-related clutter. The subject line read, "Class of 2010 Reunion Invitation." Lucas's eyebrows lifted in mild surprise. He hadn't thought about his college years in a long time. Clicking the email, he skimmed through the details. The reunion was scheduled for the upcoming weekend at a rustic retreat in the countryside, about 3 hours' drive from where he lived. The thought of reconnecting with old friends sparked a flicker of interest in his otherwise monotonous routine. "Why not?" he muttered to himself, closing the laptop. The idea of escaping his day-to-day grind, even briefly, felt liberating. He hadn't been on a proper trip in months, and the opportunity to revisit the carefree memories of his college days was too tempting to pass up. He spent the rest of the day working through his tasks with an unusual sense of purpose, already envisioning the open road and the chance to see familiar faces. Saturday morning arrived, bringing with it a dense layer of gray clouds that hung low over the horizon. Lucas packed a small overnight bag with a few essentials, threw in his camera for good measure, and headed out the door. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, but the forecast hadn't mentioned anything severe. He shrugged off the weather as he loaded his bag into the trunk of his car. The drive began smoothly enough. Lucas cruised down the highway with the windows cracked open, letting in the crisp autumn air. The countryside stretched out around him in shades of green and gold, the trees beginning to shed their leaves. He switched on the radio and tuned into an oldie station, humming along to the familiar tunes that transported him back to simpler times. About an hour into the drive, the weather began to change. The gray clouds thickened, and a light drizzle began to tap against the windshield. Lucas turned on the wipers and leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the road. The drizzle soon turned into a steady rain, the kind that clings to the air and blurs the edges of everything. Still, he pressed on, confident in his ability to navigate the conditions. The roads grew narrower as he entered a more remote area. The GPS guided him onto a winding route that cut through a dense forest. Towering trees flanked the road on either side, their branches interlocking overhead to create a tunnel-like effect. The rain intensified, cascading down in thick sheets that made visibility a challenge. Lucas gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles whitening as he concentrated on staying centered in his lane. Ahead, a faint yellow sign caught his attention. As he drew closer, the words became clear. "Bridge under maintenance. Proceed with caution." Lucas slowed the car and leaned forward, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. The bridge came into view, an old steel structure that spanned a fast-moving river. Its weathered beams glistened with moisture, and puddles had already begun to form on the uneven surface. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts tugging at him to reconsider. But the GPS showed no alternative route, and backtracking would add hours to his journey. "I'll take it slow," he muttered, easing the car forward. The tires splashed through shallow puddles as he inched onto the bridge. The rain was deafening now, drumming against the roof of the car and drowning out the sound of the radio. Lucas kept his hand steady on the wheel, his breath shallow as he focused on the narrow path ahead. Then it happened. A sudden, thunderous crack split the air. Lucas's heart lurched as the car jolted violently to one side. The bridge beneath him groaned in protest, its aged structure finally succumbing to the relentless weight of time and weather. Before he could react, the ground seemed to vanish beneath him. His car tilted sharply, the front end plunging downward. For a moment, everything was chaos: the screech of metal, the rush of wind, the sickening sensation of falling. The impact was brutal. The car hit the water nose first, the force of the collision sending shockwaves through Lucas's body. Freezing water surged into the vehicle almost instantly, filling the cabin with a chilling ferocity. Lucas gasped, his breath stolen by the cold as he struggled to orient himself. The river's current was merciless, dragging the car deeper and spinning it like a toy in its grasp. His instincts took over. Fumbling with his seatbelt, Lucas clawed at the latch until it finally released. The water was up to his chest now, icy and unforgiving. He tried to force the door open, but the pressure from the outside held it firmly shut. Panic set in as he realized how little time he had. His chest burned with the effort of holding his breath, his mind racing for a solution. And then, as the water reached his shoulders, a strange calm began to settle over him. It wasn't the calm of surrender, but something else, something otherworldly. The sounds of the rushing river and the creaks of the sinking car faded, replaced by an almost deafening silence. The cold no longer bit at his skin. Instead, he felt a peculiar warmth spreading through his body. Lucas's vision blurred, the murky water around him giving way to a soft, ethereal glow. The light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, enveloping him in a gentle embrace. His lungs stopped aching, and the pressure in his chest eased. For the first time in those frantic moments, he felt no fear. As the world around him dissolved into light, Lucas was overcome by an indescribable sensation, like floating weightlessly in a vast, boundless space. The chaos and terror of the accident seemed a distant memory now, replaced by a profound stillness. His last conscious thought before slipping away was a simple one. "What's happening to me?" Lucas's awareness returned slowly, as if he were waking from a deep, dreamless sleep. Yet, it was unlike any awakening he had ever known. Instead of the groggy disorientation that typically accompanied waking, He felt a strange clarity, as though his mind had been washed clean of all distractions and burdens. He found himself in a space that defied explanation. There were no walls, no ceiling, no discernible floor beneath him. He seemed to float in an expanse of soft, radiant light. It wasn't blinding or harsh, but warm and inviting. The light pulsed gently, as if alive, and carried with it a profound sense of peace that filled every corner of his being. Lucas looked down, or rather, he thought he did. He could see himself, but his body didn't appear solid. It was more like a faint outline, shimmering faintly in the golden glow that surrounded him. There was no water, no cold, no pain. He remembered the crash, the river, the desperate struggle to escape, but all of it seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another time, another world. "Where am I?" he wondered aloud. His voice didn't echo in this strange place. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the light, as though the question itself became part of the atmosphere. Before he could try to make sense of it, a sensation of movement caught his attention. He wasn't moving in the physical sense, yet he felt himself being drawn forward, as if the light were gently pulling him. He didn't resist. There was no fear here, only a deep, inexplicable trust. The further he drifted, the more vibrant the light became, shifting subtly in color, from gold to soft hues of pink and lavender. Then, he noticed something in the distance, or at least what passed for distance in this infinite expanse. Shapes began to form within the light, indistinct at first, like figures emerging from a dense fog. As they grew clearer, Lucas's breath caught in his throat, or at least it would have, had he still been breathing. Standing before him were people, or what appeared to be people. Their forms were luminous, their features softly blurred yet unmistakably familiar. Lucas's heart, or whatever he had now in its place, ached with recognition. Among them was his grandmother, who had passed away when he was just a boy. She looked exactly as he remembered, her kind smile and warm eyes filled with love. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice trembling. She stepped closer. Though her movements seemed more like gliding than walking, she didn't speak. But her presence radiated a message that Lucas understood instinctively, as if the words were imprinted directly onto his consciousness. "Yes, it's me, my dear. You're safe now." Tears that didn't feel physical streamed down Lucas's face. He wanted to embrace her, to feel her warmth, but when he reached out, his hand passed through hers like a beam of light. Despite the lack of touch, the connection between them was undeniable, stronger than anything he had ever felt in life. Others began to approach, their forms glowing softly, faces from his past, some he recognized instantly, while others were less clear. There was Mr. Jensen, his high school science teacher who had inspired his love for design by teaching him to see patterns in the chaos. And there was Sarah, his childhood neighbor who had passed away in a tragic accident when they were just teenagers. Each one exuded a profound sense of love and welcome, and Lucas felt his heart swell with gratitude. Time didn't seem to exist in this place, or if it did, it moved in a way he couldn't comprehend. Lucas wasn't sure how long he stood among them, listening, feeling, absorbing their presence. They didn't speak in words, but their thoughts and emotions flowed into him, filling him with an understanding he couldn't have articulated if he tried. Then, the light shifted again, drawing his attention away from the figures. A new presence emerged, one that was unlike the others. It was larger, brighter, more intense, yet not overwhelming. Lucas felt an instinctive awe, a reverence that came not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of its essence. The presence didn't take a human form. It was simply light, pure and radiant, yet Lucas felt it looking at him, knowing him completely. It was as if every moment of his life, every thought, every action, every hidden fear and unspoken hope were laid bare before it. Yet, there was no judgment, only understanding. A single thought echoed through Lucas's mind, so clear and resonant that it felt as though the light itself were speaking directly to him. "You are not done. The words reverberated within him, carrying a weight that he couldn't ignore. He didn't want to leave this place, this peace, this love. But the presence made it clear that his time here was not yet meant to be permanent. "Why?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of longing and confusion. "Why can't I stay?" The light responded, not with words, but with an overwhelming wave of images, emotions, and sensations. Lucas saw scenes from his life, moments he had forgotten or overlooked. He saw the faces of people he had touched in small, seemingly insignificant ways. A kind word to a stranger, a design project that had inspired someone, a friendship that had brought comfort in a dark time. Each moment radiated outward, connecting to others in ways he had never imagined. "You have more to do," the presence seemed to say. "Your life is a thread in a larger tapestry, and your journey is not complete." Lucas felt the truth of those words deeply, even as he struggled to accept them. He wanted to stay, to remain in this place of light and love, but he also understood that his purpose lay elsewhere, in the world he had left behind. The figures around him began to fade, their forms dissolving back into the light. His grandmother was the last to leave, her smile lingering in his mind as her presence slipped away. The light that surrounded him grew brighter and brighter, until it was all he could see. Then, with a sudden jolt, Lucas felt himself being pulled back. The warmth and peace of the light receded, replaced by a cold, crushing sensation. He gasped, his lungs filling with air as his senses returned in a chaotic rush. The world around him came into focus, the roar of the river and the metallic groan of his sinking car piercing the silence he had just left behind. Lucas was back. Lucas gasped for air as though his lungs were starved of it, the sharp intake burning his chest. The warmth of the light was gone, replaced by the icy grip of reality. He was submerged in freezing water, the roar of the river pounding in his ears. For a moment he panicked, flailing as his mind struggled to reconcile the peace he had just experienced with the chaos surrounding him. The car was sinking rapidly, its nose angled downward as the river pulled it deeper. Lucas's body reacted on instinct, his arms and legs moving before his mind could catch up. His hands found the door handle, but it wouldn't budge, the water pressure keeping it sealed shut. He turned toward the shattered window on the passenger side, the jagged edges barely visible in the murky water. Adrenaline surged through him, dulling the cold and sharpening his focus. With a powerful push, he maneuvered himself toward the broken window, squeezing through the narrow opening. The glass scraped against his arm, sending a sharp sting up his side, but he barely noticed. His singular focus was on escaping the vehicle before it was too late. The moment he was free of the car, the river's current seized him, pulling him downstream with relentless force. He kicked his legs and flailed his arms, struggling to keep his head above water. The cold was unbearable, seeping into his bones and numbing his movements. Every breath felt like a battle, the icy air stinging his throat. "Stay calm," he told himself, though his pounding heart betrayed his words. "You've made it this far." The river twisted and churned, carrying him along like a piece of driftwood. He caught glimpses of the world around him, the overcast sky above, the blurred outlines of trees rushing past on either side. It all felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't wake from. Yet, the sensations were painfully real. The cold, the weight of his soaked clothes, the desperate ache in his muscles as he fought against the current. Then, through the chaos, Lucas spotted something, a large branch jutting out from the riverbank ahead. It was sturdy and low enough to grab, but it was approaching fast, and he would have only one chance to catch it. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, he kicked harder, angling his body toward the branch. The moment his fingers closed around it, the current yanked at him with renewed force, threatening to tear him away. He gritted his teeth and held on, the rough bark digging into his palms. Inch by inch, he pulled himself closer to the bank, using the branch as leverage. His arms screamed in protest, every muscle burning with effort, but he refused to let go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lucas's feet found solid ground. He collapsed onto the muddy riverbank, his chest heaving as he gulped down air. For several moments he lay there unmoving, the world spinning around him. The sound of the rushing river faded into the background as he focused on the simple act of breathing. When he finally mustered the strength to sit up, Lucas took stock of his surroundings. The riverbank was narrow and overgrown, with tangled roots and thick vegetation clinging to the edges. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, though the sky remained a dull, unbroken gray. His car was nowhere to be seen, likely swept further downstream. Lucas looked down at himself. His clothes were soaked and clinging to his body, his arms streaked with cuts and bruises. His hands trembled as he touched his face, half expecting to find it as ethereal and translucent as it had been in the light. But it was solid, real. He was real. "What just happened?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the sound of the river. The memories of the light flooded back to him in vivid detail. The warmth, the peace, the figures he had seen, they felt more real than the world around him now. He could still hear his grandmother's voice, feel the presence of that indescribable light, and the words, clear and undeniable, echoed in his mind. "You are not done." Lucas clenched his fists, his breath hitching as the weight of those words settled over him. He had been sent back. There was no other way to explain it. He wasn't supposed to be here, and yet he was. The thought filled him with a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and a deep, aching sense of loss. He knew he couldn't stay on the riverbank forever. Pushing himself to his feet, Lucas surveyed the area, looking for a way out. The forest stretched endlessly on either side, the dense trees offering little in the way of direction. He had no idea how far he was from civilization or if anyone was even looking for him. The weight of his situation hit him all at once. His car was gone, likely lost to the river along with his phone and belongings. He was stranded, cold, and exhausted, with no clear plan for what to do next. But despite the dire circumstances, a small, persistent voice in the back of his mind urged him forward. "You have more to do." Lucas began walking, his legs heavy and unsteady beneath him. He followed the riverbank for a while, hoping it might lead him to a road or a sign of life. The drizzle soaked through his already damp clothes, and the chill in the air gnawed at his skin. Yet he pressed on, driven by a strange sense of purpose he couldn't fully explain. As he trudged through the mud and underbrush, his mind kept returning to the light. It wasn't just the peace he missed. It was the clarity. For those brief moments, or however long he had been there, everything had made sense. His life had felt connected to something greater, something profound. Now, back in the physical world, that clarity was slipping away, leaving him with more questions than answers. What did the presence mean by, "You have more to do"? What was he supposed to accomplish? And why had he been allowed to experience the light at all? The questions swirled in his mind, relentless and unanswered. After what felt like hours, Lucas's perseverance paid off. He emerged from the forest onto a narrow dirt road, its surface slick with mud from the rain. Relief washed over him as he realized he had finally found a path, though where it led was anyone's guess. He began walking along the road, his steps slow and deliberate. The sound of his wet shoes squelching against the ground was almost rhythmic, a steady beat to accompany the thoughts racing through his mind. The forest seemed quieter here, the distant hum of the river fading into the background. As he rounded a bend, Lucas spotted a small wooden cabin up ahead. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcome sign of warmth and shelter. His heart leapt at the sight. Summoning the last of his strength, he quickened his pace, his eyes fixed on the soft glow emanating from the cabin's windows. When he reached the door, Lucas hesitated, his hand hovering over the weathered wood. He felt an odd sense of déjà vu, as though he had been here before, though he knew that was impossible. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door creaked open, and a kind-faced older man peered out. His eyes widened slightly as he took in Lucas's disheveled appearance. "Well, now," the man said, his voice warm and steady. "You look like you've been through quite an ordeal. Come in, son. Let's get you warm." Lucas stepped inside, the cabin's heat wrapping around him like a blanket. The man led him to a chair by the fire, handing him a thick woolen blanket to drape over his shoulders. Lucas sank into the chair, his body relaxing for the first time since the accident. "What happened to you?" the man asked, his tone gentle but curious. Lucas hesitated, unsure how much to share. After a moment, he simply said, "I was in an accident. My car went into the river." The man nodded thoughtfully. "You're lucky to be alive. That river doesn't let many people go." Lucas shivered, his mind flashing back to the light and the figures he had seen. "I think there's more to it than luck," he murmured. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he placed a steaming cup of tea in Lucas's hands and said, "Rest up, son. You've got a story to tell, and I've got time to listen." Lucas stared into the fire, the flickering flames reflecting the storm of emotions within him. He knew he couldn't explain everything, not yet. But one thing was certain. His journey was far from over. The warmth of the fire slowly seeped into Lucas's chilled bones. He held the cup of tea tightly, the heat from the ceramic grounding him in the moment. His hands still trembled slightly, not just from the cold, but from the weight of everything he had experienced. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the rain outside. The man who had welcomed him, now seated across the room in a worn armchair, watched Lucas carefully. His presence was calm, unhurried, and oddly comforting. He hadn't asked any more questions after Lucas's brief explanation, instead giving him space to gather himself. Lucas appreciated the silence, but knew it couldn't last forever. After a long sip of tea, Lucas cleared his throat. His voice came out hoarse and uncertain. "Thank you for letting me in." The man smiled gently. "It's no trouble at all. Not many folks come down this road, especially in weather like this. My name's Walter. By the way." "Lucas," he replied, managing a small, weary smile. He hesitated, unsure where to start or if he even wanted to. But something about Walter's steady demeanor made him feel safe, as though he could speak freely without fear of judgment. Walter leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to, son. But sometimes talking helps. You've got that look about you, like you've seen something most people don't come back from." Lucas's heart skipped a beat at the words. He hadn't told Walter much, just the bare details of the accident. Yet the old man seemed to know, or at least sense, that there was more to the story. Taking a deep breath, Lucas began. "It wasn't just the accident. I mean, yes, I crashed into the river, and for a while, I thought that was it. I thought I was going to die." Walter nodded but said nothing, letting Lucas continue at his own pace. "I remember struggling to get out, the water rising around me, the cold making it almost impossible to move. And then," Lucas paused, his throat tightening. The memory of the light was so vivid it felt like he was still there. "And then everything changed. I wasn't in the car anymore. I wasn't even in the river. I was somewhere else. Somewhere I can't even explain." Walter's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Somewhere else," he prompted gently. Lucas nodded, his grip on the cup tightening. It was light, just light everywhere. But it wasn't empty. It felt alive, warm, peaceful, like I was being held by something that understood me completely. He paused again, struggling to find the right words. How could he describe something so profoundly otherworldly? "I saw people there," he continued, his voice soft. "People I knew, people I'd lost. My grandmother, my high school teacher, even an old childhood friend. They were all there, but not like I remember them. They were brighter, like they were made of light themselves." Walter sat back slightly, his gaze thoughtful but not skeptical. "And did they speak to you?" Lucas shook his head. Not with words. At least not the way we do. It was more like they spoke through the light. I just understood them, like their thoughts and feelings were poured straight into me. My grandmother told me I was safe, and the others they made me feel so loved, so welcomed. His voice faltered, the memories stirring a deep ache in his chest. He had been so reluctant to leave that place, to leave them behind. But then something else happened, Lucas said, his voice growing quieter. Something bigger than them, bigger than anything I've ever known. There was this presence, I don't even know what to call it. It wasn't a person, but it felt like it could see everything about me, everything I'd ever done or thought. And it told me I couldn't stay. Walter raised an eyebrow. It told you that? Lucas nodded slowly, not with words, but I knew what it meant. It said, "You are not done." And then it showed me things, moments from my life, things I'd forgotten or thought didn't matter, times I'd helped people, even in small ways. It was like it was showing me why I needed to go back. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Lucas's words settling between them. Walter didn't respond right away, letting the fire's soft crackle fill the space. "That's quite a story, Lucas," Walter said finally, his tone steady. "And you believe it was real, what you saw, what you felt?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "It was real. More real than anything I've ever experienced. I know how it sounds, and if someone had told me a story like this a week ago, I wouldn't have believed them, but I can't deny what I saw. It's changed me, even though I don't fully understand how or why." Walter leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "You're not the first person to tell a story like that. You know, people have been seeing things, feeling things, when they brush up against death for as long as anyone can remember. Some call it a glimpse of heaven. Others think it's just the brain playing tricks on you. But I think there's more to it than that." Lucas looked up, surprised. "You do?" Walter nodded. "I've seen a lot in my time, met folks with stories like yours. They all come back with something different, but there's always one thing in common. It changes them, makes them see life differently, makes them want to do more with the time they've got left." Lucas stared into the fire, Walter's words sinking in. He felt the truth of them, even though he was still grappling with what his own experience meant. He didn't feel like the same person who had driven onto that bridge just hours ago. Something inside him had shifted, and he couldn't go back to the way things were. After a long pause, Walter spoke again. "You said the presence told you. You are not done. Any idea what it meant by that?" Lucas shook his head. "Not really. I mean, I saw those moments, those connections I'd made with people, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. It's like I've been given a second chance, but I don't even know where to start." Walter smiled faintly. "You don't have to figure it all out at once. Sometimes the answers come when you stop looking so hard for them. Life has a way of showing you what you need, if you're paying attention." Lucas nodded, though he wasn't sure he entirely understood. The idea of waiting for answers felt daunting when the questions were so overwhelming. Walter stood and moved toward the kitchen, returning a moment later with a plate of bread and cheese. "You'll need your strength," he said, setting the plate on the small table beside Lucas. "Whatever comes next, it'll be easier to face with a full stomach." Lucas managed a small chuckle, the first he'd felt since the accident. "Thanks," he said, picking up a piece of bread. The simple act of eating felt grounding, a reminder that he was still alive, still part of the physical world. As the evening wore on, the conversation drifted to lighter topics. Walter shared stories of his life in the cabin, his years working as a carpenter, and the solitude he had grown to cherish. Lucas listened, grateful for the distraction and the sense of normalcy it brought. But even as he smiled at Walter's anecdotes, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that his journey was far from over. The memory of the light, the presence, and the message it had given him lingered in his mind like a distant echo. He didn't know where it would lead him, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. When the fire had burned low and the rain had stopped, Lucas finally allowed himself to close his eyes. Sleep came slowly, his thoughts swirling with images of light and shadow, of the life he had left behind and the uncertain road ahead. As he drifted off, one thought rose above the rest, clear and unwavering. I'm not done. The morning came quietly. Lucas woke to the sound of birds chirping and the soft rustling of leaves outside the cabin. For a moment, he remained still, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling. His body ached from the ordeal of the previous day, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. The vivid memories of the light, the figures, and the presence were still fresh, and they brought with them a weight he couldn't quite shake. Sitting up slowly, Lucas swung his legs over the side of the cot Walter had offered him for the night. The warmth of the cabin's fire had long since faded, and the chill of the morning air made him shiver. He rubbed his hands together, trying to ground himself, to remind himself that he was alive. Walter was already awake, moving quietly in the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the small cabin, mixing with the earthy scent of damp wood. He glanced over his shoulder when he saw Lucas stirring. "Morning, son," he said with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Lucas admitted, his voice still rough with sleep, but better, clearer. Walter nodded knowingly. "That's a start. Coffee, please," Lucas replied, standing and stretching cautiously. His muscles protested the movement, but the stiffness was manageable. He made his way to the small table, where Walter had set out 2 mugs and a plate of bread and jam. As Lucas sat down and wrapped his hands around the warm mug, he hesitated. He knew he needed to move on, to figure out what came next. But where would he even begin? "You've got a lot on your mind," Walter observed, sitting across from him. Lucas nodded, sipping his coffee. "Yeah, I feel like I've been given a second chance, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. That voice, that presence, it said I wasn't done, but it didn't exactly leave me with instructions." Walter chuckled softly. "Life rarely does, son, but maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about having all the answers right away, but about taking the first step and letting the rest unfold." Lucas considered this, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the world was coming back to life after the storm. The trees glistened with moisture, and the sunlight filtered through the branches in golden rays. It felt like a small reminder of the light he had seen, a gentle nudge forward. After breakfast, Lucas thanked Walter for his kindness and prepared to leave. Walter had offered him a sturdy jacket and an old backpack filled with essentials, water, a first aid kit, and some food. "You sure you'll be all right out there?" Walter asked as they stood at the cabin's threshold. Lucas nodded, though he wasn't entirely confident. "I think so. I'll follow the road and see where it takes me. Hopefully, I'll find a town or at least someone who can help me get back home." Walter clapped a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You'll figure it out. Just keep your eyes open, and don't be afraid to trust yourself. Sometimes, the road you're meant to take shows itself when you least expect it." With a final wave, Lucas set off down the dirt road. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves and earth. The weight of the backpack on his shoulders felt oddly reassuring, a physical reminder of Walter's kindness and the support he'd found in an unexpected place. As Lucas walked, his mind drifted back to the visions he'd seen in the light. The images had been so vivid, so specific, faces of people he had interacted with, moments he had forgotten. The presence had shown him these memories for a reason. He was sure of it. But what was he supposed to do with them now? The road wound through the forest, its edges lined with tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The silence was comforting at first, but as the hours passed, it became oppressive. Lucas found himself wishing for the hum of a car engine or the distant chatter of people. Anything to remind him that he wasn't completely alone. Around midday, The road opened up to a small clearing. In the distance, Lucas could see a cluster of buildings, likely a town. Relief flooded him as he quickened his pace, his legs aching from the long walk. The sight of civilization felt like a lifeline, a step closer to understanding what he was supposed to do next. The town was quiet, its streets lined with modest houses and a few small businesses. Lucas entered cautiously, unsure of where to start. He spied a diner on the corner and decided it was as good a place as any. Pushing open the door, he was greeted by the warm smell of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee. A few heads turned to look at him as he stepped inside, his disheveled appearance drawing curious glances. He made his way to the counter and took a seat, nodding politely to the waitress who approached him. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone friendly but distracted. "Just coffee," Lucas said, reaching for his wallet before realizing it was gone, lost to the river along with everything else in his car. He grimaced. "Actually, I don't have any money right now. I've been through a lot." The waitress studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "Don't worry about it. First cup's on the house." Lucas let out a breath of relief. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." As she poured his coffee, Lucas glanced around the diner. It was a small, unassuming place, the kind of spot where everyone probably knew each other. He caught snippets of conversations, laughter from a booth in the corner, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. It was ordinary, but it felt significant after everything he'd been through. When the coffee arrived, Lucas took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him. He felt a flicker of peace, a reminder that even in the chaos of his thoughts, there were small moments of comfort to be found. As he sat there, trying to piece together his next move, a man approached him. He was middle-aged, with a friendly face and a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "You new in town?" the man asked, pulling out a chair to sit across from Lucas without waiting for an invitation. Lucas nodded. "Just passing through. My car went into the river yesterday, and I've been trying to find my way back home." The man whistled low. "You're lucky to be alive. That river's no joke after a storm. Name's Tom. By the way." "Lucas," he replied, shaking Tom's outstretched hand. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying Lucas. "You've got the look of someone who's been through more than just a car crash. If you don't mind me saying, something weighing on you?" Lucas hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to share, but something about Tom's open demeanor made him feel like he could be honest, at least to a point. "It's hard to explain," Lucas began, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "But, yeah, the crash wasn't the only thing. I guess you could say it's made me see things differently. Made me think about what I'm supposed to be doing with my life." Tom nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Well, sometimes it takes something big to shake us up, make us pay attention. Maybe that river was trying to tell you something." Lucas blinked, surprised. "You believe in things like that?" Tom shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I believe there's more to this world than what we see. And I believe people end up where they're supposed to, even if it doesn't make sense at the time." Lucas didn't know how to respond. Tom's words felt eerily close to what he had been grappling with, and he wondered if their meeting was more than coincidence. They talked for a while longer, the conversation flowing easily despite the weight of Lucas's thoughts. Tom offered to help Lucas find transportation back to the city, and Lucas gratefully accepted. As they parted ways, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this small interaction was significant, another piece of the puzzle he was trying to put together. Walking out of the diner, Lucas looked up at the sky. The clouds had cleared, revealing a stretch of blue so bright it almost hurt to look at. For the first time since the accident, Lucas felt a small spark of hope. He didn't have all the answers, but he had a starting point. And for now, that was enough. The ride back to the city with Tom was quiet for the most part. The hum of the truck's engine filled the space between them, punctuated occasionally by the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Lucas stared out the window, watching the scenery blur by, his thoughts as restless as the clouds shifting across the sky. Tom seemed to sense that Lucas wasn't ready to talk and let him be. They exchanged only a few words along the way, casual remarks about the weather or the state of the roads. Despite the silence, Lucas felt grateful for Tom's presence. It was comforting to know he wasn't navigating this alone. The city skyline came into view as the afternoon light began to wane. Tom glanced over at Lucas, breaking the quiet. "Where can I drop you off?" Lucas hesitated. Home was the obvious answer, but the thought of returning to his apartment, to the life he had known before, felt wrong. After a moment, he said, "There's a park on 8th Street, near downtown. You can leave me there." Tom raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it. "All right, if that's what you want." The park was quiet when Lucas arrived, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the paths. He found a bench near a small pond and sat down, watching the ripples on the water's surface. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to sit still, to breathe, to take in everything that had happened. The memories of the light and the presence still lingered, vivid and undeniable. He replayed the moments over and over in his mind, searching for meaning in the images he had been shown. The faces, the connections, the voice that had told him, "You are not done." The words felt like a thread pulling him forward, but to where? He wasn't sure. As the sun dipped lower, Lucas's thoughts turned to the moments the light had shown him, small acts of kindness, fleeting interactions that he had barely noticed at the time. He realized they weren't random. They were reminders of the impact one person could have, even in the smallest ways. He thought of Walter's advice. The road you're meant to take shows itself when you least expect it. And of Tom's words, "People end up where they're supposed to." Maybe they were both right. Maybe his path wasn't about finding some grand purpose all at once, but about embracing each moment as it came, about being present and open to whatever lay ahead. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Lucas rose from the bench. He didn't have all the answers. He might never have them, but he felt a quiet resolve forming within him. He couldn't go back to the life he had lived before, the one defined by routine and disconnection. He didn't know what his future held, but he knew he wanted to live with intention, to make each moment count. Walking away from the park, Lucas felt lighter. The weight of uncertainty was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like an invitation, a reminder that life was a journey and that he had been given the chance to continue his. In the days and weeks that followed, Lucas began to rebuild his life, piece by piece. He reconnected with old friends, reached out to his family, and made an effort to be more present in his daily interactions. He found himself drawn to volunteering at a local shelter, using his design skills to help them create campaigns that raised awareness for those in need. Though the memories of the light never faded, Lucas stopped searching for a definitive explanation. Instead, he embraced them as a gift, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things. He no longer feared the unknown. Instead, he welcomed it, trusting that his journey, however uncertain, was leading him exactly where he needed to be. One evening, as Lucas walked home from the shelter, he paused to look up at the sky. The stars were scattered across the darkness, each one a tiny point of light in the vast expanse. He thought of the presence, of the figures he had seen, and of the warmth that had surrounded him in that otherworldly place. "You are not done," he whispered to himself, the words no longer a mystery but a quiet truth he carried with him every day. With a deep breath, Lucas turned and continued down the path, his steps steady and sure. The road ahead was still unwritten, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to walk it.